and continue onwards. So, just as a quick check, who remembers where? Oh, why are we looking at this? Who remembers where we left off last time? What were we talking about? As a hint, can anyone tell me why did we end up in the War of 1812? Just like it doesn't need to be any specific facts. Just why do you think we ended up there? Why did we end up in another fight with the much more powerful Great Britain? What do you think, Jason?
I wasn't here last time, so I don't know.
Okay, I'll post the recording soon. For you then. Um, what about you, Ethan? What do you think? I can't hear you.
America was like doing some kind of neutral thing, and Britain was like, oh, that means you're on the other side, kind of.
Yeah, so remember, and I'll share my screen in shortly, but like remember, we were really trying to figure out at a national level, how do we deal with Europe? That was the biggest foreign policy question. How do you deal with this much more powerful continent, the Europeans? How do you deal with all their interests and machinations and manipulations in the Americas? How do we make sure we get trade with Europe? Because that's the most important thing for our economy, for both the North and the South in different ways. We got to figure out Europe. The big concern is how do we deal with Europe? They're much more powerful than us militarily. They got much more powerful navies. We rely on them completely for trade, and we need to keep them happy, and we need to keep them balanced because we can't be all for the French and lose all their trade with Great Britain. We can't be all for the British and lose our connections with the French and other powers. Um, we we're really stuck between a rock and a hard place. Our solution, like Ethan said, is let's try to be neutral. Let's try to not offend anyone. In the end, it ends up offending everyone. And it ends up being that the French get mad at us because we are letting the British take our goods. We're signing Jay's Treaty and other things that establish friendships, economic friendships with Great Britain. We're letting Great Britain, which is again Great Britain and France are at war right now. We're letting Great Britain take the goods off of U.S. ships bound to France, and then Great Britain gets angry because we try to do things like the embargo of 1807 to we try to stop them from impressing our sailors, taking over our boats. We try to stop Great Britain from basically like attacking U.S. ships. So at this point in time, our idea is let's be neutral. That doesn't work for a few reasons. Can anyone think about why, like fundamentally, why does neutrality not work? Ethan, Sebastian, can you turn your cameras on? I just want to hear your ideas. Jason, even though you weren't there, why do you think it doesn't work for us to pretend to be neutral between our friendships between Britain and France?
I mean, if you try to be neutral, certain countries will only look at like what's affecting them and they won't see the whole picture. So they'll just get offended.
Yeah, that's a really intelligent way of looking at it, Jason. That like neutrality is easy to see from a bird's eye view. Like, oh, they're being equally nice and mean to these two countries. But when you're at the receiving end of it, you're like, oh, they're just being mean to us. I don't really care what they're doing with the other guy as much. I just care that they're being mean to us or they're doing something to offend us or something like that. So you have to remember each one of these countries looks at things from a biased point of view. They get offended, like France gets offended when the US does anything nice for Great Britain, but they don't really care as much when the US does something mean to Great Britain because they're like, oh yeah, that's good, do that. So the perspective is really important. I'm really happy you highlighted that there, Jason. Okay, what do you think, Ethan? What's another reason?
A reason that like neutrality would not exactly work in
Yep,
foreign
why it didn't
policy.
work.
because the more powerful countries would see that America would be like doing business and helping the countries that they would consider their enemy, even if like they're doing business with them too.
Yeah,
But they
and
would
oh wait, keep going, sorry.
but they would still go like, oh, okay, America must not like us a lot.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, and I especially like how you brought up like these more powerful countries. And that's a critical part of this. Like these countries, like they wouldn't do this if we were about as strong. They wouldn't want to risk war or risk trade problems if we were about as strong as them militarily. But they feel like they can push back on us for these like reasons that you and Jason brought up, because they feel like we can be harassed, we can be messed around with. We're not going to really be able to do any harm to them. So they're fine taking over our ships. They're fine stealing our goods and attacking our vessels and taking over and forcing our sailors to be part of their navies. Because they're like, I mean, like, they're kind of just like this weak little power. They're not going to be able to do much to stop us. They rely completely on us. Why do we really have to listen to them? Like I mean, they kind of managed to beat Great Britain in that revolution thing, but it was because us French helped them, and it was kind of lucky. It was because Britain wasn't that invested. Like they don't really feel like this is some sort of like magical new powerhouse. They don't feel America is what it is today, which is a superpower. They see America as a developing country, um, which might not be the same as just any other colony or any other place, but it is like not something of a similar stature to Spain or England or France. And so when we talk about why the US went to the War of 1812, we have to remember this belief we were trying to dispel. We needed to be taken seriously. So the War of 1812, in many reasons, was kind of like a coming of age war. Like think about it. It was about when the U.S. was like 20, or 20, 23 or 24 or whatever. And it was kind of the United States saying, okay, that's enough. Like we don't just get played around with. Great Britain, if you keep taking over our boats, impressing our sailors, you keep doing all the like damaging our trade, you keep destroying our trade with France, destroying our vessels. That's not gonna we're not gonna stand for it. So we're gonna fight. So it's really important to remember that this is like kind of us being like enough's enough. We're our own country now. We have our own power, and we're gonna put our money where our mouth is. We're not just gonna talk diplomatically. We're gonna prove that we have the ability to hold our end of deals. If you break a deal with us or you mess with us, we have the ability to actually do something about it. There are consequences. So Jason, can you tell me some of the similarities between that description of the War of 1812? What are the similarities between that war and the Revolutionary War that you can think of?
I mean, both of them started because like countries weren't taking America seriously, and they wanted to like show everyone that they were a legitimate thing.
Yeah, and to build on that, I might like if I was writing hint hint like a FRQ essay or something about this, I might mention something about how both had to do with a fundamental a value of American freedom and autonomy. Like Americans just care about that. We love freedom, we love autonomy. That's like the big thing. And in both cases, we saw other countries messing with the autonomy and the self-determination of American citizens. In the revolution, it had to do with a lot of people on our land. In the lead up to the War of 1812 and the embargo of 1807 and all that sort of stuff, it had a lot to do with at sea, our merchant class, which affects at home because that's cotton growers, that's sugar plantations, that's Boston and New York harbors, all depend on this sort of trade. So we have to understand that in both cases, there's just this fundamental thing of you guys are betraying our value of being able to choose to do what we want. We get to do what we want. You need to leave us alone. We're not trying to bother with you. You just need to not bother with us. And that kind of like fundamental American value stemming from senses of freedom and self-determination and liberty and autonomy. That those themes, they don't just apply to individuals in our country. They also apply to the country overall in relation to other countries in the War of 1812 and the Revolution. Oh, hey, Sebastian, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, hey, Sebastian, what do you think might be a difference between the War of 1812 as I described it and the Revolution? What's different here? I can't hear you. Can you guys hear him?
Well, I'm thinking.
Okay, I'll come back to you in a second. Ethan, how about you start us off? What is the difference here?
The difference between the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War,
Yep, what are the main differences?
like France didn't provide a lot of aid that much during the War of 1812.
Okay, so yeah, like we're kind of at odds with Britain again, but in this case, France isn't really our friend anymore. So remember, alliances shift and they mean a lot, especially to a growing nation. Okay. So Ethan, more than that, what do you think is different in terms of the American mindset? What is there something different we're trying to accomplish?
Like, I think the Revolutionary War was like, oh, we want to like detach, kind of like get independence, but like the War of 1812 was like, we want to keep our independence.
Yeah, and that is a very different attitude because in the War of 1812 we were a lot better organized. Like we still had a lot of troubles because Britain was also better prepared and better organized, and they were taking us more seriously than they did in the Revolution. Which is why they were able to take over our capital and burn the White House and all those like major things. But like you're saying, that there is a major difference between us being like, okay, we're gonna form something. We have the idealism and this like rebelliousness of forming a new country versus something more akin to the War of 1812 is we know now after 20 years we want it our way. We figured out something that some start of an idea of what it means to be American. And we want to maintain that idea. We want to nourish it. It's a little less rebellious and it's a little more patriotic. I mean, you can even think about how our national anthem came out of the War of 1812, not the Revolutionary War. One is about youthful idealism, rebelliousness. It's about like that part of it. If you haven't seen the musical Hamilton, I'd highly recommend it. Watch it on Disney Plus. Amazing. That's what the Revolution is more about. The War of 1812 is slightly more mature. It's more patriotic. It's more we have created something here. We have created something independently, and you need to respect that. And we will stand by this and we'll defend these things. So that's just an important difference. Sebastian, did you think of anything you want to add?
Nothing really more than that.
Okay. So let me screen share. We can talk over what I've got here. Ethan, Sebastian, could you please turn your cameras on? Wait, why isn't this working? Okay. So what I want to do to before we get into new material is I want to give you all a chance to let's do a little practice, like actual A-push exam questions. And I want to see what you guys are thinking along these lines. So that we can see, like, get some real exposure to what these questions look like. So I'm going to read this passage, and then I'm going to have somebody read the first question to me. So, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Thomas Jefferson, The Declaration of Independence, 1776. Okay, before we even look at the questions, it's important to comprehend what's going on. So, Jason, what is Thomas Jefferson saying here?
That governments basically get their power from the people, and that if the people aren't happy, then they have the right to disassemble that government.
Exactly. And especially like saying like when a government might become tyrannical, or like is that's often the biggest fear at this time. It's not just that the government is inadequate or inept, that's part of it, but it's when the government is tyrannical and controlling and suppressing and limiting of liberties. That's the overriding thing. Nowadays we care more about, oh, our government's just not doing what we care about. That those days they cared much more about the government is doing too much. It's controlling too much. Okay. So the excerpt was written in response to A, British government's attempts to assert greater control over the North American colonies. B, British government's failure to protect colonists from attacks by American Indians. C, colonial governments' failures to implement mercantilist policies. Or D, colonialist governments' attempts to extend political rights to new groups. What do you think, Sebastian?
Well, it would have to be A, right?
Okay, let's. Why do you think it's A?
Well, better. Well, the general idea is, well, the general idea of what Thomas Jefferson wrote was that uh, was was that if the people don't like the government, they have the right to abolish it, right? So in this case, it was specifically before, in the few years before Declaration of Independence, there were the British government did assert their control over North American colonies, and the people of them were happy.
Okay, that's a good argument. What do you think, Ethan? Do you agree with what Sebastian said?
I think I agree with like it should be A.
Jason?
Yeah.
Yeah, so just to, like, this I think is an easier question, but just to highlight that AP questions, there's not always like one right answer. There's one best answer, which can get annoying at times, but usually you have to use logic to figure out what's like the much more important one here. So yes, some of these other ones are true. I mean, I wouldn't say C or D are likely the true answers, but B has some validity to it. Like um, colonists, like we remember with Bacon's rebellion a century earlier, were annoyed that the British government wasn't protecting them from Native Americans. And more recently, after the 7 Years' War, the British government gave away a lot of that land west of the Appalachian Mountains to the Native Americans to avoid conflict with them. So, and colonists were really mad about that. That's helped start a lot of these problems. However, I agree with all of you that A is the better answer. A is the much more relevant answer. The idea of tyranny is not only like the big problem when it comes to the revolution, like we about Thomas Paine's Common Sense, about the intolerable acts and the Tea Party and the Boston Massacre and all those sorts of things. And again, remember when you're writing FRQs, writing actual like free response questions, not just the multiple choice ones. As a side note, it's really important while you have these your most of your essay should be theoretical and broad based and not just summarizing, but like constructing your own ideas, make sure to reference a few events you can remember. Like for example, if you're talking about Britain tyranny, talk about the Sugar Act or the Stamp Act or something like that. Learning these specific events is not history. The use of it is more to be like a supplement. It's to take your essays and your writings to the next level because you can reference them as examples. So don't rely on that. Don't just think, oh yeah, I memorized every single artifact in APUSH, so I'll do great on the test. That's not going to work. However, make sure to at least know some general things you can refer to in your exam. Anyway, so the other point I want to draw your attention to here is like, even though I think all of you guys could conclude that it was A without even reading that passage, when we're talking about this excerpt in particular, A is even more obvious because the passage is very clearly about tyranny. It's very clearly, as I think it was Jason who said, it's very clearly about governments that become destructive of consent of the governed, that don't really respect their people, aren't really controlled by their people. So, and this is going to be a constant thing you're going to see throughout APUSH exams. Multiple choice questions are always structured in this way. You'll have a paragraph, and you'll usually have like 4 or 5 or 6 questions relating to that paragraph. Either a paragraph or a map or a chart or something like that. Usually an excerpt from a historical document like this one. Answering the questions often won't require you to even read the paragraph. Many of the questions can be answered without it. However, it's really important you read the paragraph and learn how to get through that older style English, because the paragraphs will often have hints which help you answer the question, some more than others. Like for example, this one, even if you weren't sure between A and B, you read that paragraph, you're like, oh yeah, okay, that paragraph is about tyranny. It's about Britain controlling things. And that's what A is saying. So the paragraphs help you. They're not going to answer the questions for you most of the time. They are not necessary per se to answer the questions most of the time, but they help you. They will give you context about what's going on, especially like the date, like 1776 here. And they will also often mention the specific events. So you don't have to memorize everything. Often the events will be mentioned in the paragraph, which allows you to focus more on synthesis and more on understanding rather than memorization as you prepare for the exam. Let's move on to the next question. Okay. So, Ethan, can you read the question out loud?
The ideas about government expressed in the excerpt are most consistent with of the following.
And read the options.
A. The concept of hereditary rights and privileges. B. The belief in manifest destiny. C. The principle of religious freedom. D. The ideas of the Enlightenment.
Okay. So what do we think, Ethan?
I think it should be D,
Why do you think it should be D?
because the excerpt references many ideas of like kind of a social contract where the government is there because the people who are being in government are okay with being there. And if the people aren't okay, then they can get rid of the government. And that's like an idea that's very prevalent during the Enlightenment.
Exactly. So yeah, I would agree completely here. The so just as a reminder, the Enlightenment was kind of this intellectual movement that started the century before this, so kind of the 17th century to the 18th century. That's the 1600s to the 1700s. And the Enlightenment, like Ethan said, it covered many different like changing views about religion, about leadership, but probably one of the most important new views introduced is the idea of a proper government being controlled by the people themselves. And more on top of that, the ideas of liberty and self-determination and control of one's own like freedoms, freedom to own property, freedom to choose your life decisions, things like that. So the like two dominant, I guess 3 dominant ideas you should just be familiar with from the Enlightenment, which was fundamentally a European intellectual movement that migrated over to America. The 3 fundamental things you should know. One is the idea that governments shouldn't be all powerful. Like it shouldn't be just one person in charge of everything. For example, Montesquieu wrote about checks and balances, having different branches of government, like a legislature, an executive, a judiciary, that balance each other out. So no one group is too powerful. They're always balanced out. And that gets integrated into the American Constitution, because we have three branches of government that balance each other out. Two, the idea that people should have a say in their government and what their government does through referendums, through voting, through choosing their leaders. And three, that people have some fundamental rights. There is some fundamental freedoms and rights and liberties afforded to a human being. That they deserve the ability to own property. They deserve the ability to speak in some situations. They deserve the ability to like control their life and choose who they marry and things like that. So these ideas seem obvious to us now. They were not then at all. These were new ideas then. And I hope you can see how all three of those ideas, balanced checks and balances in government, voting and people controlling their government, and fundamental freedoms, those are all some of the biggest foundational values in the American Constitution and the Bill of Rights. So the Enlightenment is very closely connected with the foundational structure of American democracy. It's not like we just came up with all these ideas. They were being developed by intellectuals in Europe for more than a century before this all happens. And before then, many of these ideas were toyed around with 2,000 years before in ancient Greece and ancient Rome. Not to mention in other continents, but most of those didn't really impact America as much. All right, great job, Ethan. Completely agree. The Enlightenment really is reflected in this passage. Okay, let's do another one. Practice is really useful for these. Sebastian, can you read this passage out loud?
What do we mean by the revolution? The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effective consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effective from 1760 to 1775, in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington.
Okay. And remember, always, like, that was great, Sebastian, but always make sure to read the byline. I know you might have done that to yourself, but that'll really help.
John Adams, former president of the United States, letter to Thomas Jefferson, former president of the United States, 1815.
Okay, so suddenly that tells us a lot of information. For one, it tells us this letter, I mean, beyond being written from a president to another president, it was written well after the revolution. And that might tell you it's more of like a retrospective. It's looking back. It's not something in the heat of things. It's not in the heat of battle. It's more of a historical take. Obviously, this is now a historical document to us, but for them at this point in history, the revolution was history. Revolution had happened many years beforehand. So let me read out the first question. Which of the following, one second. Just gonna turn on this light. Which of the following is the most likely reason why Adam dates the beginning of the American Revolution to the 1760s? A. Renewed efforts by Great Britain to consolidate imperial control over the colonies. B. The forging of American Indian political alliances with European powers. C. Increased involvement of colonial merchants in the Atlantic economy. Or D. The expansion of the colonial population into the interior of the continent. Okay, what do we think here, Jason?
Okay.
A. What about you, Sebastian?
I agree. I don't know why that cuts me on A.
Ethan?
For the first question,
Yep.
A.
Yeah, so this is like a great example of when elimination helps more. Like you might like read this and you're like, okay, what's like, I read this passage above. It talks about that the revolution wasn't really about the war. It was about the period that led up to the war, before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington, things like that. So, like, if I were just to like answer the question randomly, I would say like why he thinks that the revolution started earlier than in the 1760s has to do with American resistance, like to the Stamp Act and American growing in their distaste for colonial control and things like that. Now, this one doesn't really say that explicitly, but if you really read through them, three of these answers don't really align at all with the idea of why a revolution happened in the hearts and minds of Americans well before the actual war was fought. The only one that kind of aligns with that is that Great Britain tried to control the colonies more. And then I know in turn that leads to us resisting that control, and that is like kind of part of the process. So it's important to when you're not, I mean, like maybe you guys were more certain about this answer than I was, but when you're not certain about one of these AP questions, really a big part of it is elimination. You can usually like be like, okay, at least two of these are just complete nonsense, and one of these is just less connected than the other. Use the most relevant and connected answer. Even if it still doesn't feel perfect, that's probably your best avenue. So AP questions in particular are really conducive to eliminating the weaker answers first, if you can't just immediately spot the correct answer. I used to do this all the time. I would just cross out, like as I was going through the answers, I would cross out the obvious ones. And then if I still haven't figured it out, I would go back and then like compare the like remaining two or three to see just which one is more connected to what I really think the answer would be if I didn't have any choices. Yeah, so elimination of choices is really important. Okay, let's go down to this next one. Which of the following factors most directly contradicted Adams' theory about the revolution? So Adams' theory is up here. The existence of a considerable loyalist opposition to the patriot cause. B, the existence of significant social okay, let's just do this exercise. Do you guys think we should eliminate A, or should we at least keep it for now? Ethan?
I think we should keep A.
Go ahead. I would agree. B, the existence of significant social and economic divisions within the colonies. Should we keep that, Jason?
Yeah.
Yeah, this one is already looking like it's going to be a difficult question. Okay, C, the importance of colonial military victories in bringing about independence.
No, we shouldn't keep that one.
Why do you say that, Sebastian?
Well, well, that's not the point. I think Adam's point is something like is it's something like the revolution.
Okay, so Sebastian, like, so we'll get to like this part, and I honestly think you're right. However, I want to stress that when you're first eliminating questions, like your first thing when going through these AP questions should be like, which of these, like, as I'm reading these answers, which of them is just obviously like can't be right. And this one I can like feasibly see it like being like the contradiction is Adams is saying the revolution happened before the like in this 1760s, but really we only had independence once we had military victories. So I would keep this for now. But I think your logic is pretty sound too, Sebastian. Okay, D, the importance of support from European allies in defeating the British. So I would say probably no here. Had probably kind of along Sebastian's similar logic. I might say like, okay, this is probably not this. We'll revisit it if we have to, but like let's ignore this one for now. Okay, so of those three, Jason, what are you leaning towards right now?
C,
Why are you leaning towards C?
because the passage is mainly about how the revolution was like separate from the war, but this says that the war was kind of necessary in order to achieve independence.
Okay. And what do we think about B, Ethan? Do you think it seems reasonable, or you prefer C or A?
I think like I would prefer C or A.
Yeah, so I would agree. I feel like social and economic divisions, it's kind of vague, and it doesn't really have much to do with like like contradicting Adam's theory. Like if anything, it might actually support Adam's theory. So maybe we can drop B for now, and then we have to focus on C and A. And C and A, I think, are actually like, this is a very difficult choice for me. Like I'm not sure exactly um which one I would choose, but I feel like both of them are very strong answers. So Sebastian, which of those two would you choose?
I would pick A.
Okay, so Sebastian's leaning A. Why do you lean A?
Well, it feels like what Adams is in what it feels like what Adams is implying is something like it is something like the entire America, that all of the Americans had the same like mindset as the Patriots. Well, no, not the Patriots. Yeah, no, it was the Patriots. Okay. So there was a considerable loyalist opposition, but I so there was a considerable loyalist opposition, but things could have completely gone the other way instead.
Okay. Um, Ethan, what do you say?
Like between C or A.
Hmm.
Uh, if I, hmm, I would probably have to lean towards A.
Okay, A. And Jason, what about you?
Let's see.
Actually, if
C.
I think
Yep.
actually I'm thinking about it, and it could actually be both at the same time.
A what?
Both at the same time.
Yeah. So
Like the military victories were important because otherwise it might like trigger some if the U.S. did I mean if the Patriots did lose the war, then that might have triggered something in response from the loyalists, and something might happen.
so I think, like, again, so this is like, this one is so difficult to the point I think it's perhaps not the best question, but you're going to encounter ones like these, and you have to be able to move through them quicker than we are right now. So in this case, why do we think A might be the right answer? Because it's about like the mental part about it. Like Adams is saying, the revolution was in the minds of the people. And this is about how there's a lot of minds, a lot of people were not convinced. C was about how the end goal, the actual goal of a revolution, overthrowing a government, getting independence, that required us to actually win battles. So the answer here would be C. I should check on this, but I'm pretty sure it's C. Because it's the most direct response to the prompt. The most direct response is the idea of Adams is saying a revolution happened before the military victories. A revolution happened in 1760 to 1775. That's when the real revolution happened. A contradictory point is that we weren't going to get independence. We weren't going to actually have a real like control of ourselves. We weren't having any sort of revolt against a government until we actually won in real battles. That's the most direct refutation there. the idea that there is a considerable loyalist opposition that can exist even without the even with the revolution happening. Not everyone has to be convinced. So I would say C would be the more appropriate answer here. Okay, let's go on to the last question. And again, like the point is, I just wanted to outline how you should approach these more difficult questions. You narrow down the obvious ones like D, and then B. Get rid of them. And again, you have to speed this up as you practice yourself. And then you're like, which of these is more connected? Both of them seem like I can see logical explanations, but I'm just going to go with the one that more directly answers the question and is connected to the paragraph. Use the paragraph to decide the disputes. Okay, finally, 20. Which of the following aspects of life in the United States in the early 19th century most likely influenced Adams' recollection of revolutionary events? So just quickly, Jason, when is the 19th century?
The 1800s.
Yes. Like I know it's a stupid question sometimes, but like I still sometimes just in my head I like, oh yeah, 19th century, 1900s. Like it's just automatic sometimes. So always remember to go back a number. Don't make
from
fun of
what?
us, Sebastian. What? What were you saying, Sebastian?
The way I remember is the first century is the century starting with the year one.
That is a good way of doing it. Um, just whatever works for you.
What?
What?
It's century number one.
Not the best century though. Best century is our century. We're the best century. But yeah. So whatever floats your boat to remember it, just always make that conversion automatic in your head. Otherwise, doing a history exam is going to be really slow going. So, which of the following aspects of life in the United States in the early 19th century most likely influenced Adams' recollection of revolutionary events? A. The rapid development of the market revolution. Jason, what do you think the market revolution is?
Like a more structured economy.
Yeah, so like you haven't encountered that specific term maybe before. I have not encountered. Oh, I've encountered it a few times, but it's not like a very common term I see around. However, I know this period of history. I know America's moving, like after Adam Smith writes his treatise on the invisible hand and on capitalism, America's moving towards like a less controlled, more market oriented ecosystem where companies exist and trade with each other and things like that. Remember, companies weren't much of a thing until like recently at this point in history. So the market revolution forming there. Okay, B, the development of a national culture and a national identity. What do you think about those two? Do you think they should stay, Ethan, or any of them should go away?
Which one should stay or go away?
Either of those two. What do you think?
I think that like A has kind of nothing to do with this.
Oh, wait, A has nothing to do with this. That's a good answer. Um, because markets don't really have like tell us what to do when it comes to um like any of this. It doesn't really tell us like, oh yeah, this has to do with like politics and revolutions. That's not necessarily like what we're talking about as a market revolution. We're talking about um a revolution that has to do with politics and fundamental rights and the Enlightenment. Okay, but you probably keep B, I'm guessing, Ethan.
I think B can stay around.
Yeah, because B is vague, and you don't want to get rid of vague ones too quickly, because it could mean all sorts of things. So we want to make sure we look at the other ones first. So the growing popularity, the growing popularity of the idea of manifest destiny. What do we think about this, Jason?
It can stay.
You can stay for now. What's manifest destiny as far as you remember? We haven't talked about it yet.
Like the urge to expand.
Exactly. It's more than just the urge. It's this like idea in American minds that we have like this God-given, like this fundamental God-given pursuit to expand. It's not just our want to expand. It's our right. It's our right ordained by God to expand. God is leading us to civilize Western lands. But we'll get into that later. Okay. And then Sebastian, what do you think about D, the rapid growth of a mass democracy?
What exactly does a mass democracy mean again?
Okay, so what do you think it means? You're going to encounter a lot of these things on AP tests or other similar tests where you're not sure exactly what it means. What do you think a mass democracy might mean? Just piece apart the words. So, Sebastian, what's a democracy? There, Sebastian? Hello?
I guess a mass democracy actually would be a democracy for more, would be a democracy for more people.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it. Okay, we have a democracy where people support, like, and get to choose their politicians. And then a mass democracy is going to be when a lot of people, like a large mass of people, get to do that choosing. And that's like kind of what happens in the early 19th century. Because remember, when the Constitution was first ratified, many states, I mean, of course, for a long time, they restricted away from people of color, they restrict voting away from women, but they also even restricted voting away from like white men who didn't own property. They had all sorts of other weird restrictions. So this was like the first barrier to fall in the early 19th century. A lot of the barriers against like propertyless, like poorer white men fall. And then later in the century, we're going to get to black men getting to vote. And then later in that century, and kind of at the turn of our century, women getting to vote. Okay. So what do we think about this, Sebastian? Do you think it should stay?
Hmm, don't know. It doesn't seem relevant.
Okay. What do we think, Ethan?
Well, I think he's like kind of right.
So if I were going through this, I would say, okay, yep, you're right. Market revolution should go away. Um, if I was going to be, I was like, okay, it's vague. We probably have got to keep this. It could be about national identity, like us. Like our perspective of a revolution could be driven by like that revolution creating our national identity. C, be like, okay, manifest destiny. Well, one, a lot of that happens after 1815, and two, I like, I don't really think that's what they're talking about here. They're not talking about expansion or land stuff. And so I'd probably get rid of C. And D, I'd say like, okay, this is also vague. Maybe a democracy is what he's talking about here. He's talking about us growing and us creating a democracy through this revolution in our minds. So I might keep D around. So of those two remaining choices, Jason or Sebastian first and then Jason. Sebastian, what do you think?
I would pick B.
B. Okay. And Jason, what would you pick?
B.
And Ethan?
I would also pick B
Oh wait, Ethan, why would you pick B?
because like the development of like a unique American kind of thingy is like something that happens in the mind. And also like C doesn't make as much sense as B, and like D also doesn't really make as much sense as B for this question.
Yeah, so I would also in this case pick B, and B is the right answer. And the reason I think, I mean, honestly, again, I think this is kind of a vague question, but I think we have to operate with this idea of, okay, let me figure out, what does he mean by a revolution? What does John Adams mean about a revolution? He's talking about this new way of living, this new American thing forming in people's minds. He's not necessarily talking about a structural thing. For example, the rapid growth of mass democracy, though he could be leading up to that. I think that could be, like he was saying, like this is the groundwork for mass democracy. He's talking more about an ideological thing. So of those two, I would actually say it's a difficult choice, but B is probably the better answer because it's speaking more to that ideological mental part of the equation. Again, this one, like if I were doing this test, I could easily end up picking D. If I was going through these questions quickly, speeding it up is one of the more difficult parts of this, but B is the correct answer here. And the last thing I want to highlight to you here, another like tip for the AP exams, is always when you choose an answer, think of a reason to convince yourself it's the right answer. Just like how I asked Ethan, why do you think it's that way? And then he has to come up with like a statement, like logically, this is why this is the right answer. So, like, of course, if you're in a time crunch, just circle what seems the most likely to be the case. But just like a way to quickly confirm everything lines up and everything's logical is just in your head. Once I choose an answer, I'm like, okay, yeah, that makes sense because of X. I just think out the logic for why why that would be the correct answer. Kind of like reversing the question and answer. I'm saying like this is what happened, so that makes sense of why this paragraph was written or something like that. So explain it, like thinking in my head, thinking out that logical connection between the development of national culture and national identity, leading Adams to write about a revolution of the minds and things like that, versus the development of democracy, leading to that happening. Okay, cool beans. So I think we'll push these off for later. Maybe we'll just do one quick FRQ. I just want to hear what your answers are for this. So identify one factor that increased tensions between Great Britain and its North American colonies in the period 1763 to 1776, and briefly explain how this factor helped lead to the American Revolution. So again, all of these questions are real AP questions. Those multiple choice are like real multiple choice questions. These are real FRQs. I'd say some of these, other than those John Adams ones, are on the easier end. But we'll build up to more harder questions that cover more parts of U.S. history. Anyways, so can anyone answer A for me? I'll give you guys a few seconds to compose your thoughts.
The British taxes.
Okay, tell me more about it. The question asks, what is the factor, and explain how it led to the American Revolution.
Well, after the 7 Years' War ended, the British wanted to tax the Americans because they didn't have much money. So and the Americans didn't really like the taxes. So
Okay,
that
sorry.
increased tension, and the tension led to American Revolution.
Okay, let's critique everyone's answers here. So firstly, I think your answer is really strong. I think your reasoning, especially the first half, was great. The factor, higher British taxes, maybe even mention like the Sugar Act or Stamp Act. Why did it, which they raised because they were poor after the 7 Years' War and needed more revenue. How did this led to the American Revolution? Because Americans didn't like taxation. Maybe get a bit more specific here, like taxation without representation, or taxation that was infringing upon their liberties or stuff like that. And they pushed back with things like the Boston Tea Party in the Continental Congresses, which helped lead to the revolution. So again, you had the logic perfectly. Just make sure every step is clearly enunciated. And like, for example, if it asks for how like the factor leads to the American Revolution, put extra emphasis on that connection between higher taxes. It doesn't just annoy Americans, it annoys Americans for what reason? It annoys Americans because it's taxation without representation, or because it's suppressing our economy or our commerce or stuff like that. Okay, B, let's have Ethan do this one. Ethan, what's another answer to the same question?
one factor that increased tensions between Great Britain and North America from the period of 1763 to 1766 was the increased control of Great Britain to its North American colonies. This helped lead to the American Revolution, as the Americans previous to this time period had enjoyed a greater period of freedom and independence in conducting their activities away from Great Britain. Since Great Britain had instituted more control on the American colonies, for example, putting troops into Boston or revoking the ability of Americans to govern themselves, this helped develop to events that would also help develop to events that led to the American Revolution.
Okay, so I feel like you kind of had the flip of Sebastian. So Sebastian's first half was really strong, second half was a bit vague, but then he improved it. I think your second half was really specific, like really great. Like, what are the specific things about how, like with the Boston stuff and everything, how did that lead to the revolution? But your first half, like, what is the factor? I want you to be a bit more specific than increased British control. So could you tell me something more specific than that?
Like Britain installed their like own governors and like officers and stuff.
That's great. So like the way I would, if I was writing this and I had time, I would be like, I loved how you had structure to it, by the way, but I would say like the increased the one other second factor was increased British control, through, but particularly through, taking over all the colonial governorships and subjugating colonial, like, legislatures or something like that. So having that general statement, like increased British control, like you did, but then adding a few specifics there. And then the rest you did, I thought was fantastic, where you mentioned, alluded to salutary neglect. If you remember that term, it's great to mention it. Again, if you don't remember the terms, you can still be fine. Just make sure to explain what you're thinking. Okay, and finally, let's hear, Jason on the third factor. Hardest question, since we've already covered two great answers.
A third factor that led to increased tensions and the revolution was the unreasonable level of control that Great Britain asserted on the North American colonies.
Wait, what did you say?
The
Can you repeat that?
A third factor is the unreasonable level of control asserted on
Okay, so
the
we've had
colonies.
Sebastian has talked about taxes. Ethan has talked about control in the form of like colonial leadership. What's a distinct reason? Because I feel like control has kind of been covered. Can you explain something that's different? I know you have the hardest job because like they already came up with two of the first ideas. But what do you think something that's new is?
Like the violation of basic human rights.
How do they do that?
Like they make like regular people take in soldiers and make them live in their house, and they don't let them like vote or anything.
Actually, I have a separate idea.
Okay, what's your new idea, Sebastian?
The Enlightenment going on in Europe.
Okay, yeah. So I get like again like when you approach one of these questions, and a lot of the FRQs, if even if they're not this explicit, they're gonna require you to give multiple reasons to support an argument. And before you even start, you should just try to quickly go through your head like, do I have a few reasons? And just like quickly get them down in your head. Like, so for example, beyond taxes, beyond colonial governments, I love Jason's, suppressing human rights or annoying people by forcibly quartering troops. Like Sebastian said, wait, Sebastian, what did you say again? Sorry.
The Enlightenment.
Yeah, the Enlightenment, new ideals, new ideas of democracy and human rights coming from the Enlightenment. I would also potentially consider saying, Britain restricting American territory, after the 7 Years' War, so they couldn't expand past the Appalachian Mountains, or Britain restricting who America could trade with. controlling who they could sell their products to, things like that. So there's many different answers here. I think Jason and Sebastian's one, both of your second ideas, your new ideas are great to answer this question. And so, Jason, could you explain a bit about how the quartering of troops, forced quartering of troops, helped lead to the American Revolution? Even if it's kind of obvious.
Like, colonies kind of all hate the troops, and the Great Britain, like the government making them forcibly house them, kind of like just increased tensions because they brought them closer together.
Yeah, so yeah, like be like be clear about like just what is the most obvious answer here. It's that it's annoying, and two, people feel like they have no control over it. So it made Americans feel like they were like being under tyranny, that they had no control over their own homes even, and that motivated them to go fight for the rights of freedoms and to avoid this sort of situation. So again, like state the logic in your head and then write it down. But that's a great answer though. And it was a difficult one I think to come up with because like taxes and control are I think the most straightforward and probably the most direct answers there. Okay, cool beans. So, I like let me know what you think about running through these questions more often in class. Probably not for this long, but I'm gonna try to do this every now and then because I personally think getting some exposure to the actual questions, discussing them is going to be really really helpful, both in terms of reinforcing your knowledge, but also in terms of preparing for the exam if you plan on taking that soon. So cool beans. Any questions, comments, jokes, anything? Jason, what's your favorite joke?
I don't make jokes.
You don't make jokes?
No.
Okay, what's your favorite comedy?
Favorite what?
What's your favorite comedy? Like funny movie, funny TV show, funny YouTube channel.
Uh, Parks and Rec.
Parks and Rec, that's a great choice. That's one of the best ones. Love Parks and Rec. Okay, Ethan, what's your favorite joke?
My life.
Um, we support you, Ethan.
I'd say my life is a better joke than yours.
Guys. I don't want positive messages, please. Your lives are not jokes; they are meaningful.
They are
Go
meaningful.
hang in there. Okay, I'm not good at motivational speeches, I guess. But anyway, I feel like I should spend the rest of class trying to motivate you guys into not considering your lives jokes. But fortunately, you have to learn U.S. history. So, we talked about a lot of this stuff. Not a very good transition. But we talked about how we try to be neutral. We talked about these four fundamental tenets I outlined. Sorry, there's a bit of a delay. We talked about these loading. Okay, yeah. We talked about these four fundamental tenets of what we were trying to accomplish with our early foreign policy. One, which was probably like the most important, is retaining and growing our trade networks with more countries, especially with Britain and France, especially with Britain. Two, avoiding any major wars. That didn't really happen, but like trying to do that for as long as possible, because we weren't ready to fight European powers and it would really hurt us. Three, staying out of European conflicts to avoid the problems it would cause for trade or getting us into a war. And four, Europe staying out of our domain, staying out of America. And so, as we talked about, we had all these different, like the XYZ affair, which increased tensions with France, Jay's Treaty, which eased tensions with Britain, but also increased them with France. And then these kind of culminated in one major trade thing, which didn't work at all, which was the Embargo Act of 1807, where we're basically like, because you guys keep messing with our ships and taking over our ships and harassing our everything, we're going to basically prevent any trade with Britain or France. And it didn't work because our economy was so dependent on it, it destroyed us much more than it hurt them. So since the economic attack didn't work, we weren't as economically powerful then as we are now. Then the war becomes the next step of what happens, the last resort, where we join the war against Britain, kind of with France, but mostly by ourselves. And they managed to burn the Capitol, burn the White House. Eventually, we end the war 3 years later, and we improve our nationalism. We prove economic independence. We prove that we're our own country, that we can control our borders. There are consequences to messing with us. And after this war, I believe the only like successful campaign, this was like the last long-term campaign ever fought on American soil, and the only successful campaign since after that, the only like even attack on American soil, major attack, was kind of in the Mexican-American War, but not really, and then Pearl Harbor, and 9/11 if you count that. So
And
it's just
also,
what?
whatever. And also because I'm a history nerd, a random event on the Aleutians in World War II.
Like when like Japan attacked like California, is that what you're talking about?
Like when Japan attacked the Aleutians, which is technically a random.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, so in terms of continental America, like the actual 48 states, if you exclude Hawaii for now, it is really important to realize just how much of an advantage we have by being separated by two oceans. Like it's annoying nowadays if you want to go on vacation to like China or to Paris or wherever. However, at the same time, it's the reason we weren't invaded for like 200 years. Like after the War of 1812, we become powerful enough, and independent enough and economically strong enough that we don't get attacked. Like that's just an incredible thing. Like almost every single place gets attacked in that period, gets invaded in that period. Being isolated by water is the best barrier possible. It's why Great Britain had so much success earlier on, that it was separated from continental Europe and could more easily defend itself because of that. That's why it was able to survive so long in World War II. For example, more recently, probably one of the biggest reasons Taiwan exists right now is because it's separated by water from mainland China. So it's a lot harder for China to attack Taiwan. Part of the strength of Japan in the early, like the last few centuries, has been by being an island, being able to develop itself in a more secluded and protected area. When you have to attack somebody by bringing a bunch of boats full of soldiers, it's really expensive. It's really difficult. So always remember that advantage America has, and remember to think of similar situations. Anyways, this all culminated in the Monroe Doctrine under President Monroe, which basically was the pinnacle, the main idea of American foreign policy for the next century was built upon this idea. We don't mess with Europe. We don't get involved in Europe. Europe, you don't get involved with our hemisphere. You stay out of the Americas as much as possible. So we're isolationists. We're not interventionists. We're not really getting involved. That's not our job. But in return, we expect you guys to leave us alone. So we've talked a lot about the foreign policy aspects. We need to touch a bit on the economic and geographical side of things. So I'm sure many of you have heard of the Louisiana Purchase, where we buy a giant amount of what becomes our the future American continent, a country, sorry, in the Louisiana Purchase. It includes Louisiana and basically a ton of what runs along the Mississippi River. Indeed, you can see one of those lines very much traces the Mississippi. So very cheap. Like, I mean, $300 million today is a lot of money, but like, imagine if, like, not even a billionaire, but like a very wealthy multimillionaire could buy like a third of America. Very, very cheap. So this is kind of what started the next phase. Like, it's kind of kickstarts this whole manifest destiny thing, which builds up over the next few decades. Again, manifest destiny is God ordained duty for us to move westward, civilize the West, control this entire land from sea to shining sea, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And this is the first one of the major steps there. To be clear, westward expansion has always been a theme, and it will be till like the early 1900s. We talked about how westward expansion was a big reason for annoying Great Britain, getting annoyed with Great Britain, that we wanted to fight the 7 Years' War back in the mid 1700s so that we could control the land that was over here, west of the Appalachian Mountains, which are like here. These are the Appalachians. So we wanted to be able to control land there. We fight the war with Native Americans and the French to get that. And then the Great Britain's like, actually, never mind. We don't want to offend. We don't want to have more conflict with the Native American tribes. So you guys can't go live there. And then Americans are annoyed with that, people in the colonies. And now, so that was like westward expansion was a period there too. And then past the Mississippi is kind of the next major barrier. And we talked a bit about this is a whole new domain geographically. It's very different geographical features, which enables a very different economy. So, Jason, what do you think is different about this area here that makes it geographically different from what the United States was like over here?
I mean, it's like a lot and more consistent. There's
Yeah, I really like that you use the word consistent because everything in this area is dragged to the coast because the coast is the best. Like, I mean, if you have the same weather, if you have the same properties, you want to be by the coast or nearest to the coast or near a river that comes from the coast so you can do shipping there. That's like just so useful to be able to have ports and have a port city. So cities really form and are pushed towards the coast. Here, there are major rivers. Like, it's really important to understand the Mississippi and how powerful that is. So many cities form alongside the Mississippi's, including the capital of my home state, Minnesota, Minneapolis, forms along the Mississippi. But there's also other rivers. Like, I mean, I'm not going to trace these exactly, but there's like the Missouri River, and I think there's a Kansas River, and there's the Ohio River, and stuff like that. There's the Colorado River, which comes like something like that. I don't remember exactly. I think it actually goes more around, but many of them link up with the Mississippi, and many of them offer great avenues to initially trade alongside, and eventually through boats, and eventually to power like mills in early industrialization, for mills for textile, for clothing production, and for other sorts of processing, energy production. What do you want to add, Sebastian?
Sure, when you mentioned the Colorado River, you said it flows eastward.
What? Sorry, what?
When you mentioned the Colorado River, you drew the line on the screen going east, going generally eastward, right?
Oh, sorry, I don't know where the Colorado River is, to be completely honest.
Like no, the Grand Canyon is through the
Yeah,
Colorado
it
River.
goes like here, right? Like this.
So it starts from like there, no, and then it goes like it keeps going westward into the Gulf of California.
Okay, cool. Maybe the Colorado has other purposes. I don't know. I know it goes through Colorado and the Grand Canyon, and that's about it.
Cross the border into Mexico.
What? Sorry, I can't hear you.
Goes across the border into Mexico.
Okay, big point here, big takeaway here, is understand how important rivers are. Rivers, cities are born on the riverside. We're not yet at the point where you have large train tracks yet. Trains don't really exist yet. They'll take another 50 years or so to really build up capacity. Once you get to that point, you'll see a lot more like next level American cities forming alongside train tracks. For example, my actual hometown, Rochester, Minnesota, is literally located at a hub of train tracks. Like that's why the city started. It's grown into something else since then, but there's no major rivers here. But transit and power. First, transit is the most important thing any city can provide, and water is the best method of transit at this point in history. And two, power. And water, unlike anything else, can provide power to early industrialization, early mills for textiles, early things like that. So don't underestimate the power of rivers, and of course the ocean, but especially rivers when you go inland. I also want to highlight that. The area here, the climate is different, even though like it's at a similar latitude and longitude, stuff like this. The climate is more grassland throughout much of this area. Much more farmland, many lakes, things like that. So part of the economy eventually that develops here involves a lot more pastoral lands, and down here a lot more grazing for like cattle and things like that. More grain crops grow well here, like corn and wheat. And that's eventually over the next century going to develop into the primary agricultural part of this area. And the south is going to be both grains and a lot of animal, like chicken, especially cows, things like that, because it's a little warmer weather. But there's also a lot of grass for the cows to graze on and everything. So let's remember how the environment determines the living structure. Cool beans. So, do you guys want to try this out? It shouldn't be too difficult because one of them you already read, sort of. Raise your hand if you do not want to do this now. You want to move on. Okay, I'm going to assume Al, if you want to do this now. Cool. So, let's just quickly read this again. Jason, just quickly read the first paragraph.
As to the history of the revolution, my ideas may be peculiar, perhaps singular. What do we mean by the revolution? The war? That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people, and this was effected from 1760 to 1775, in the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington. Former President John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, August 1815.
Okay. So we read this already. We talked about how this was a revolution in the mind. We talked about how that was the fundamental idea here. Let's see this other one. And you're going to see this again a lot in both multiple choice and especially in FRQs, where they give you like two different passages and they want you to use your critical reading and analysis and historical understanding to compare and contrast them. So let's hear from Ethan about this Benjamin Rush thing.
Like, read the passage.
Yep.
There is nothing more common than to confound the terms of the American Revolution with those of the late American War. The American War is over, but this is far from being the case with the American Revolution. On the contrary, nothing but the first act of the great drama is closed. It remains yet to establish and perfect our new forms of government and to prepare the principles, morals, and manners of our citizens for these forms of government after they are established and brought to perfection.
Okay, so let's do the first level before we even read the question. What is the main difference here, Ethan?
Like the main difference probably is that Adam says that, oh, the revolution is kind of like over, but Rush says that the revolution is actually still ongoing.
Yeah, so it's like one Adams is saying the real revolution happened before the war, and Rush is saying the real revolution is happening after the war. Much of it is happening after the war and still ongoing. And it's funny that no one here is arguing the revolution happened during the war. But anyway, so that's kind of what's going on. One is saying we still have to, Rush is saying we still have to establish, um, the principles and the morals, and we have to establish and perfect our new form of government and make it work, and we have to always be growing it. Adams is saying the real revolution of moving to this, it was moving to this new form of government, this new ideology, and that happened before the war. Importantly, look at the dates. Adams is looking at this from a historical perspective. Rush is looking at this from a in the moment perspective. This was in 1787. Um, so he's like right in the mix of the Constitution being created and things like that. Okay, so let's answer this first question. Briefly describe one significant event, significant difference between Adams' understanding and Rush's understanding of the American Revolution. So I kind of hinted at a lot of that. Jason, can you tell me one significant difference?
One significant difference is that Adams' perspective views the revolution as having occurred already, while Rush believes that the revolution has just begun and that the revolution will continue to occur as America develops.
Okay, so that'll probably get you the points, Jason. But just to make sure, remember to always like justify your more vague points. So, for example, like yes, there is like one Adam's saying it happened, the revolution happened before. Russia's saying it's still happening after the war. But tell me why they're saying that, just briefly. So, why does firstly answer this, Jason? Why does John Adams say very in your own brief words? Why does he say the revolution happened before the actual war?
Uh, because he's probably talking about this in the context of already having won independence and being like a free nation, while Rush is kind of in the aftermath, and he's in the context of like having to build up, no, not build up, but like develop America as a country.
Okay, so yeah, in just like the brief thing was what you said first. It was about the mental buildup of the new ideas in Adam's perspective, and then in Russia's perspective, it's about needing to perfect our institutions as part of the revolution, and that's the big difference. One happens before. Adams is saying it happened before the war because it was about getting our minds prepared to move against Britain, and Rush says it happens after the war because he says it's about the continuous process of perfecting our institutions. Okay, cool. B. Briefly described how one specific historical event or development from the period between 1760 and 1800 could be used to support Adams' interpretation. What do we think, Sebastian? As a hint, Sebastian, think about what happens in the period Adams is referring to.
Yeah, the 7 Years' War and all the British taxes and stuff.
Okay, so when we narrow it down to the period Adams is talking about, what happened or what development or event happened in that period would you feel indicates this idea that the real revolution, the changing of everyone's minds, happened in that period?
Like the Boston Tea Party.
Yeah, that's a great example. So the thing about these is your answer is going to change based on your example. In this case, if you choose the Boston Tea Party, which is kind of a consequence of a lot of this, you can say that the Boston Tea Party embodies this because it shows how America was um, starting to see itself as under the tyranny of Great Britain and was pushing out against that sort of thing. So that would be a good way of doing that. Or you could say an event is a development is Britain preventing Americans from moving to past the Appalachians because it angered Americans that they couldn't move more freely. Or you could talk about how the Sons of Liberty formed to rebel and spread information against the British government during this period. Or there's many different ways to approach this. Remember, your answer changes based on whether you're talking about a cause or an effect. Boston Tea Party is more of an effect, so then you have to explain the cause in the context of what Adam says. Appalachia, more of a cause, then explain what that leads to in the changing American psyche. Okay. And Ethan, tell me a historical event or development from the period blah 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 to support Russia's interpretation.
Probably like the inauguration of John Adams,
Why do you say that?
because he is like, oh, the revolution is still going on and we need to like make our government better. And the inauguration of John Adams, like the first peaceful transition of power between like a guy who willingly gave up his power and some other guy who was going to get his power who wasn't like related by blood to the guy who just lost his power.
Yeah, so I would say either that or even the transition from Adams to Jefferson. Both of them would be great examples. I think yours is particularly clever because it's in response to the Adams piece. Um, so I think that's a great example. Um, we still were learning, we were still developing, we were still doing that sort of thing. I think more specific to the idea of institutional revolution, I might touch on the Articles of Confederation failing, getting replaced by the Constitution or stuff like that. But there's again many ways to take this. I think yours worked well. I think also to focusing on the Articles and the Constitution would also work in this case.
I would even say something like, I don't know, Marbury v. Madison, and even though that wasn't 1760, 1800.
Yeah, so you would be completely right about Marbury v. Madison. But if you were writing this answer, I would highly recommend you, like, if they say a time period, stick to that time period. And honestly, even if you're unsure about when something happens, you knew it in this case, but when you're unsure about something happens, I would rather you use a worse example that is that you know is within the time period, because I mean it depends on the grader on these tests, but you just don't want to risk it. Um However, if it had a wider time period, I think Marbury v. Madison is a fantastic example of expanding and changing and powers of the government and how those evolved in the early years of our country. So I think that's a great example, but I just wouldn't use it to answer this question because of that time restriction, like you said. Okay, so like we talked about, one of the big failures of the kind of Articles of Confederation government was the money problems. The how the we formed individual debt to be paid off for the war debt by each state, and how that didn't work, and how the Constitution resolved some of this by having national taxes, a national military, and having a central bank, or at least the implicit idea of a central bank, so that there was a national debt. So no one state was overburdened. So the first bank of the United States forms under Alexander Hamilton's tutelage, who's the Secretary of the Treasury. Stores like, has federal funds to do economic investment, help with infrastructure. Again, it's pretty limited at this point in time, but it's there, and it's the start of a federal institution. Nowadays, like, this will become the US Federal Reserve, which is the Bank of the United States nowadays, is extremely powerful. In fact, it has, I think, on its balance sheet, which is kind of like how much money it uses, is about, I think, $8 trillion now. So quite high. So these early banks weren't as successful though, because they were smaller, they were less powerful. The federal government invested less money, so they didn't really have to do that much, and they were not popular because, like, it was like the idea, like, should the our federal government really be controlling any money? Like, we want our states to do things, we want our cities to invest in things. We don't really want our federal government doing things at this point in our history. So in um 1811, a kind of inopportune moment, they dissolve it. So the Federalist Party, like Alexander Hamilton's party, John Adams' party, they're super in favor of these national bank stuff like that. But Jefferson, Madison, these kind of Democratic Republicans, they're against it. They don't like that idea of federal power, and so it closes down. It's kind of the wrong moment because literally a year later we get into this another massive expensive war, and we now don't have a bank to finance it. So we form the Second National Bank. And again, states don't like it because it's the federal government controlling money and things like that. Even though it actually helps states by them not having to pay off debts locally. But like the states that are better off with the debts, they get annoyed with it, even if the states that are bad with debts are better off because of it. So there's always some unhappy states, some happy states. And as we talked about earlier, McCulloch v. Maryland, remember that case where Maryland tried to tax this bank, but then John Marshall in the Supreme Court decided that there's implicit powers, that since Congress has the power to spend money and the power to tax money, it implicitly has the power to create a bank, even if it doesn't exactly say that in the Constitution. Because you have the ability to tax money, you have the ability to spend it, you have to have the ability to store it somewhere. So for a while, the second bank exists because of the Supreme Court. Okay. And we're starting to see early changes that are setting the stage for more federal power. Federal power, again, I keep trying to stress this to you guys. Early on, everyone is really suspicious of it. Everyone wants to avoid tyranny. Everyone wants, like, most people want their states to control things. People don't feel that much kinship with people across the country. It's going to take a while for America to feel more unified. Things like the War of 1812, like I talked about, help us feel more like a country when we're fighting against Great Britain there. The Mexican-American War unifies us so much. The Civil War unifies the northern states more cohesively, even though it divides the country overall. The northern and southern states just develop their own cultures. And slowly over time, we're going to get to the place where the prerequisite to more federal power is always going to be that people feel kinship, people feel common national sentiment with other people of the country, not just other people of their state or of their city or of their neighborhood, that they feel like their brothers and their sisters can live in another state, and they support those people and those people support them. Nowadays, Americans feel kinship all over the country, at least relatively speaking. At that time, it didn't really exist. So we're starting to see that chicken and egg feedback cycle. First, you have more kinship, more feelings of interconnectedness, whether it's by fighting a common war or something like that. So kinship with countrymen. And then that leads to people are more supportive of federal power in that case, because they're like, oh yeah, we're fine with a government of all of us, of me who lives in Minnesota and somebody who lives in Texas. But then that in turn, when you have more federal programs and more interconnections, whether it's like through bigger roadways or canal systems or rail systems or companies or trade systems or whatever, that increase, like at a federal level, the connection between the states, well, that'll also in turn further boost kinship with your countrymen, because you'll have more connections with people in other states. So of course there's other factors in all of this, like wars, like war kind of feeds into this separately. Um, transit feeds into this, comms feeds into this, communications, um, a lot of different things. But my point here is to understand how companies, like national companies, not statewide or local companies, but national businesses feed into this. But I hope you understand that sort of feedback cycle, how we increase our kinship through war, through bigger companies, through better transit. That leads to more federal power, and that in turn often feeds back into feeling more common ground in the long run with other people of the country. And Gibbons v. Ogden is a big Supreme Court case, which is kind of paving the way for more federal power. So in Gibbons v. Ogden, this guy Gibbons, I don't know his first name, he has the federal authority, so the federal right has been given to him to have steamboat passage. But this competitor, Ogden, was given an exclusive right specifically by New York. So now we're seeing the laying of the problem here. So if the federal government says something versus if the state government says something. And this passage has to do with like rivers that flow through multiple states. So the Supreme Court decides under the Constitution, yes, states have the ability to decide what goes on within their state. But when some sort of commerce, like this sort of commerce of boats, travels through multiple states, then it's under the federal power. Congress has first authority here. So if Congress says something, it trumps any specific state. So it interprets this as really giving a lot of power to this commerce clause in the first article of the Constitution, saying, okay, if this like tiny little river or lake was only within New York and your boats only operated within New York, and that was it, then New York has the authority. But since it moves through multiple states and you operate through multiple states, Congress, this federal government, has the supreme authority there. And so this is like kind of the beginning of more power for the federal government to regulate commerce throughout the states, starting with transit and interstate trade and things like that. And eventually the power increases to include things like food regulations and company like regulations that operate in multiple states and things like that over the next century. So Gibbons v. Ogden is kind of setting that stage for more federal power. Any questions about this? No? Cool beans. Okay, so common theme of these early parts of American history is lots of booms and busts. The economy is very volatile. During the 1800s, our economy overall was growing like gangbusters. It was just doing super well with industrialization. It was growing like crazy, especially towards the latter half of the century. However, there were a lot of instances where things just didn't work out. A lot of these had to do with poor federal management, like a weak central bank, things that are seemingly avoidable, but at the time, because of their fear of the government and of tyranny, they weren't really avoidable. A lot of it also just has to do with ignorance of the financial institutions, of speculation. Does anyone know what speculation is? I'll give you a hint. Who here? Raise your hand if you know what Bitcoin is. Bitcoin or cryptocurrency. These are basically right now, they're speculative assets. What that means is they don't have any value. Bitcoin isn't used for anything meaningful, but people are guessing that it might be. So they're just going to trade, they're going to buy it for higher prices because they're like, oh yeah, somebody's going to buy it from me later on for even higher price. That's what they're thinking. I personally think that those kind of things are somewhat nonsense, but there's other speculative industries that are more reasonable. For example, land speculation was very common in the 19th and 20th century, where land prospectors would like go around and be like, okay, I've seen this like land in the wilderness of Florida or in the Wild West, and I think this land has some natural resources. and it has some, some potential to, like, it's near a river, or it has good weather, it has good field land or something like that. It's flat, things like that. And then investors in the East Coast would be like, okay, I've never even been to this piece of land, but I'm going to buy it. And I might even pay a higher price for it because I'm going to speculate that eventually it's going to be even more valuable once all the land over there develops and people start farming here. So land speculation has its benefits because it has like investors like investing in good quality land that could be really important and useful in developing that land. But it also has downsides. Most notably because people are ignorant. Like, many of these investors often have never even seen the land they own. They're just relying on the words of others. And in some cases, the land is not nearly as good as people think it is. Speculation underpins many periods of great economic growth for a country, but over speculation is also the cause of the biggest economic failures in our country's history. So, for example, if you ever have to talk about the Great Depression, we'll talk a lot more about this later, but a big driver of the Great Depression was land speculation, where a bunch of investors in like Wall Street and stuff like that had bought a ton of land in like Florida and other places that they were told and they thought was going to be super valuable, but turned out to be like swampland. That, like, the value didn't exist. So that once people found that out, the stocks dropped like crazy. Similarly, more recently, who here has heard of the 2008 financial crisis, or the 2008 the Great Recession? It was a major, major economic cataclysm not too long ago. Some of you might not have been born at that point, but it was pretty recent. So the Great Recession was a pretty bad financial, economic recession. It was the worst one we've had since the Great Depression 100 years ago. And the Great Recession was driven not by necessarily like land, like fields and farmland and whatever speculation, but housing speculation. Basically, what happened is, one of the main reasons was there were a bunch of people who were getting mortgages, like mortgages to buy their houses, because mortgage is basically a loan to buy your house, because most people can't just buy their house out of pocket with like money they just have. They get a loan that they pay back over the next 30 years. And that's what a mortgage is. So a lot of people are getting mortgages. Most people get mortgages to pay for the house. That's normal. But then a lot of these people were buying homes they couldn't really afford. They were buying homes they couldn't pay back the mortgage on. And investors were happily giving them money indirectly, because they were like, oh yeah, we think the housing prices will always go up. We think housing market's great. We think everything's great. So they were just happily just pumping money into this without realizing just how many people could not pay off their loans. And when that realization came out, when investors and the government realized that a ton of people are going to default, that means they can't pay off their loans and are going to lose their houses, the housing market crashed, because people just couldn't, because not that money didn't exist in the first place. Investors thought it existed because they were like, oh yeah, housing prices are going up. I keep investing in the housing market. I keep giving out more loans, building new houses, things like that, because it's great, without realizing just how many people who were buying these houses couldn't pay for them. So the value of the housing market was in actuality a lot lower than people thought it was. But economic recessions don't just happen because something is bad. They happen because we speculate that they're really valuable, and we inflate the market, and we inflate everything, and we build houses, and we hire people to do jobs. And then suddenly we realize that wasn't the case. Our fake imagined reality crashes down to real reality. And that crash is what really hurts. Not like, it would be fine if our vision was here and it was just kind of slow. It's obviously great if the speed of growth of an industry is something like that. The worst case scenario often is if we think it's like this, but then we suddenly realize it was actually more like this. This drop, that change where we suddenly realize that drop is really what causes many big financial crises and recessions. So let me make sure my computer doesn't die on us. So that's just a quick econ lesson. Are there any questions about that? I know that was a bit rapid. Anyways, so let's look at what one of these first economic panics are. Now, we talked a bit about how there was a big recession, maybe a depression in the economy right after the war, right after the Revolutionary War. Why? Because a lot of people are coming home. They need jobs after fighting. They can't get them. War boosts the economy like crazy. And so once you finish a war, you have a bunch more people who want jobs, who are fighting in the war. The government's spending way less. The government needs to tighten its purse strings because they spent so much money. It becomes a lot harder. So war is hugely boosting of most economic growth, especially if your country isn't getting destroyed by it. Like Germany's economy didn't grow as much in World War II because their industry was getting destroyed by bombs. But usually it boosts an economy. War boosts an economy. But at the same time, right after the war, the economy will crater. There are exceptions. We'll touch on them, but that's a general rule of thumb. Okay, so an economic panic. So basically, we have just an absolute crash across the board in prices of like especially important things like land and housing. Land and housing are the most important things that exist in terms of pricing because people spend the most of their money on housing. There's a lot of things that cause this, but the most important thing to note is that the biggest cause was fragility. That even these smaller, like little changes could cause a major economic problem. Fragility of the early American economic system. So, for example, lower cotton prices hurt the South. The national bank becoming less liked meant that they weren't giving out as many loans to other banks, and they weren't really propping up the economy. Other countries were developing factories, were exporting more, so our goods were being outcompeted. So we have to almost every economic crisis is the coalescence of multiple causes. But in this case, what I really want you to take away from this is that we were not prepared, we were not well insulated from small negative shocks to our economy. We kind of plummeted at the first sign of trouble. So that's a major takeaway. Fragility of our early economic system. The second important thing is that a lot of this had to do with our lack of unity. Major differences in the economies and ideologies of the North and the South. The South didn't really want to deal with the central bank or the federal institutions and things like that. So cotton prices hit them really hard. The North wanted to focus more on using tariffs as weapons to avoid other countries from undercutting our prices or outperforming our products or things like that. A lot of disagreement means not a lot of federal action and not a lot of unified action. And you kind of need unified action when you're dealing with foreign countries. You need one country to go mano a mano with another country. You can't have 7 states have one version, 6 states have another version. It doesn't really work. A lot of problems led to this. Okay. So I'll touch on those later. Let's quickly do a few quick questions. So, although the Supreme Court was the weakest of the 3 branches of government in the early days of the New Republic, John Marshall strengthened the court by A, establishing the principle of federalism, giving federal courts the power to declare laws unconstitutional, B, declaring the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which asserted the rights of states to nullify federal laws unconstitutional. We'll get to this in a bit, but like the main idea here was that it was like Virginia and Kentucky wanted to say like actually we can say federal law doesn't apply to us by nullifying it, this made up process, and eventually like basically the Supreme Court says like no, you can't do that. Federal law supremacy. C, establishing the principle of judicial review in the case McCullough v. Maryland, or D, establishing the principle of judicial review in the case Marbury v. Madison. Okay, what do you say, Sebastian?
Well, it has to be D.
Okay, yeah, I would agree with you. Like these questions aren't these ones aren't official AP questions, but you'll see ones like these too. This one's kind of easier and more factual than an actual AP question, but quick, like like cheat to remember is that like as you can see here, a lot of the answers are given to you. Like for example, it explains what the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are. Again, AP tests are pretty nice. They usually give you a lot of the answers, like in terms of the information. You just have to be able to logic your way through it and remember what those were about. You don't need to recall specific events, but you need to recognize them and understand their place in history. So yeah, um, one like A is kind of like a trick. Like yes, the big change was the power to declare laws unconstitutional, specifically the Supreme Court, but that wasn't federalism. That was judicial review, which was established in Marbury v. Madison. Cool beans. Ethan, what's your answer for number 2? Louisiana Purchase was an important factor in the development of the U.S. trade because it A, opened new markets amongst the West Indian nations, B, gave the country complete control of the Mississippi River, C, added numerous French factories in Louisiana Territory to the U.S. economy, or D, facilitated the immediate completion of the Transcontinental Railroad.
I would say B.
Yep, would completely agree with you there. Remember, rivers super important for trade, super important for forming cities, eventually important for power. C, not really true. Again, by eliminating things. D, also railroads take a lot longer to develop. As I said, like knowing the rough time period of things is really helpful. Louisiana Purchase is 1803-ish. Railroads really only mature in the 40s and 50s and 60s of the 1800s. So it takes longer. A, kind of true. Yes, we did manage to trade with new tribes and everything, but that wasn't really the driving change in U.S. trade. It was really the Mississippi River. Okay, so many major cities have formed around along the Mississippi River. Okay, finally, Jason, the controversy over. Oh yeah, we haven't. Never mind. We haven't touched on this specific topic yet, so we'll come back to this later. So the market revolution. I know we saw this in a question earlier, but and you guys figured out a lot of these things. So market revolution involves probably 3 main shifts. First, in the 1820s, we see, like we talked about, a more capitalist system built upon open markets, free trade, supply and demand. Like you sell something, I sell something, we gotta figure out how to compete with each other to price so that people buy our products. Like if you're selling the same product at a lower price, no one's gonna buy my thing. So I gotta lower my prices to match you. And then eventually you find the supply of products will equal the demand of products and stuff like that. So capitalism, the idea of an open free market, not one controlled by the government, not one where like communism where everyone gets equal portions of everything. It's where you create more of something at a better quality or a lower price point, you're gonna be a more successful businessman. Okay, so that's the first major change. Second major change is that businesses and as a result markets move more from just like local mom and pop shops to more national or statewide companies that operate in multiple states. Or like a product will be produced in one place and then it'll be sold to another state and sent alongside like in ocean travel or through a river or eventually through rail systems. It'll be communicated, information about the products being sold in exchange will be communicated eventually through telegraph after things like the Pony Express, more things like the mail and then telegraph. So the market revolution is reflective of improved transit, improved communications, and especially an improved sense of national identity. So all of those things contribute to companies operating at a national scale rather and trading between the states just regularly, rather than a local scale. And then finally is the importance of innovations in this, like the cotton gin, like early other loom technologies, textile mill technologies, early parts of the Industrial Revolution, which we'll touch on next week, which really changed the game because it forces us to have national markets, because the innovations and the builders, the manufacturers of these machines might operate in a different state from yours. Labor might come from a much wider range of places now. Steamships make transit much easier for all these things. So we have to remember that these innovations, like steamships, like the cotton gin, like all of these things, may kind of force you to operate at a more national scale. So that's the market revolution. Okay, I'd say we move on to Andrew Jackson's a pretty big shift. So let's move on to him next week. Are there any questions? Any comments? Jason, did you manage to come up with a joke yet, or do you still not like jokes?
No.
Okay,